Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for being here today. I'm Skip Rutherford, Dean of the Clinton School of Public Service, and we welcome you to this evening's program. Those of you that are our regular attendees know that I'm going to ask you to turn your cell phones and your BlackBerries off, if you can. I would appreciate that so that it won't interfere with our speaker or PA system. Our speaker will be introduced this afternoon by a friend who met him through a leadership group in the dental industry and has worked with him from time to time. DJ Daly is the fourth generation resident of Little Rock. You might recognize the last name. He graduated from Catholic High School. He served in the United States Navy. He graduated, earned his doctorate in dental surgery from the University of Tennessee, and has been very active in the leadership positions in the dental organization. You also need to know that he has one of the neatest email addresses of anybody you've ever seen. If you ever email him, it's called smiledaily.com. And so that shows you that why he was voted the best of the best cosmetic dentists in Central Arkansas over the past few years. So would you please welcome Dr. DJ Daly.
Thank you. Thank you, Skip, for the introduction. As Skip said, I met Joe Grieboski through a leadership group that I have been in for about a year now, and he impressed me immediately. He had founded a nonprofit organization called the Institute on Religion and Public Policy, and he found this in his early 20s. And an organization that he created due to his recognized need for greater voice in religion in the policymaking process. In just a few years, he had taken the Institute to a point of being a well-respected organization, and not just nationally, but internationally, including being nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize in 2007 and again in 2008. Prior to founding the Institute, Mr. Grieboski earned a bachelor's degree in foreign service and a master's degree in national security studies from Georgetown University. He's held leadership posts in both the public and private sectors, and he currently serves as the founder and secretary general, and I'm going to take a second here to make sure I read this correctly, the founder and secretary general of the Interparliamentary Conference on Human Rights and Religious Freedom. He also is the chairman of the International Consortium on Religion, Culture, and Dialogue, and is a member of the National Board of Directors of the Delta Phi Epsilon National Professional Foreign Service Fraternity, and many other distinguished posts. What most impressed me when I met Mr. Grieboski's, when I met him for the first time, was his tireless work toward furthering basic human rights around the world, including areas of conflict, such as Darfur, Sudan, where he put himself in harm's way for his cause. Please join me in welcoming a true national and international public servant, Mr. Joe Grieboski.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It is a great pleasure to be here, and with an introduction like that, I'm reminded of the words of President Johnson, who used to say, "That's an introduction my father would appreciate and my mother would believe." So thank you, DJ. I appreciate that. My topic this evening is labeled as Religious Freedom, the Missing Arrow in the War on Terror. But the fact is that freedom of religion is, in fact, the missing everything of public policy. Earlier this week, participants in this gathering heard from Dr. Welton Gaddy, a great hero and leader in the religious freedom front. And Dr. Gaddy spoke very heavily on the concept of freedom of religion as a church-state issue. But freedom of religion is far more than a church-state question. Freedom of religion is the foundation, the building block, and the root of all other freedoms. Freedom of religion encompasses and expresses every other fundamental freedom. Some of you are thinking, I agree. Others are saying, I have no idea what you're talking about. how does one right encompass all the others? Well, actually, it's built on this premise. Freedom of religion is not about religion. It's about belief. Because there are three major distinctions when we talk about divinity questions, when we talk about religion questions and belief questions. We have spirituality, we have faith, and we have religion. Spirituality is my individual belief structure. It's about me and the big guy. It's my belief or disbelief. It's my relationship or lack of a relationship with a concept of a divine. It's personal and internal. Faith is a communal concept. I and others who agree on certain principles gather together to discuss those principles, to worship together, to pray together, to express those principles. Religion is politics. Religion is structure. It's institution. It is rules, regulations, dogmas, doctrines, and institutions built around the defense of the first two. So freedom of religion is actually about my individual right, not just about the rights of an institution. But if I don't have the right to hold my beliefs, then I don't have the right to speak about my beliefs. I don't have the right to write about my beliefs. I don't have the right to sit with others and talk about my beliefs. So I do not have the right of freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly. So built into the premise of freedom of religion and into the concept is every other freedom. But freedom of religion is not just about church-state questions. It's not just about the right to express those beliefs. Because like every other fundamental right, it's about engagement. Freedom of religion must be engaged at every segment of society. We must be speaking with the media. We must be talking about freedom of religion within an interfaith context. We must be talking about freedom of religion as national security, hence the premise of the title of my speech. We must be talking about freedom of religion in the context of business and economics. Business and economics, you might say. What does religion have to do with economics? We can talk about everything from Islamic banking to religious freedom in the workplace. Freedom of religion is not just about church-state questions. Freedom of religion is about engagement with every segment of society, and I will repeat that until even I get it. Because it is not an easy concept to grasp. It is not an easy issue to deal with. Because arguably, freedom of religion is also the most closely associated with the most elemental parts of human dignity. Because it is about ourselves. It is about our quote-unquote private matters, which have public expressions. And I challenge a person, and I know I'm going to get questions later on about this, so I'm putting the challenge out there now, to name one country anywhere in the world where we're not finding challenges to freedom of religion at every single one of these levels and segments of society at which I've already discussed. But the premise of the discussion tonight is about freedom of religion as a national security question. How does freedom of religion, something which is ultimately about the right of the individual, play a role in national security? I'll tell you a story. The country of India has 1.1 billion people. In a country about the third the size of China, which has 1.7 billion. India is made up predominantly of Hindus, but by the year 2020 will be the largest Muslim country in the world. There will be more Muslims in India than currently Indonesia, the currently most populous Muslim country. There's a significant Christian population, which has its roots from St. Thomas the Apostle, who went from Jerusalem to Goa, India in 52 AD. So from the apostles themselves, Christianity has its roots in India. Even Hinduism in India is not monolithic. It's not hierarchical. Hinduism has many different manifestations and understandings. But with the existence of so many minority groups, next to countries like Pakistan, who are not friends to the populations in India, as we all know, with neighbors like Nepal and Bangladesh, social questions become national security questions. Anecdote. If you're a targeted minority population living in a country that creates not just an atmosphere of intolerance, not just an atmosphere of disintegration from society and separation from society, but active, in some cases, persecution of those religious minorities, you ultimately have three options. You take it, which is what the majority of minority religious populations do. You leave, or you respond. The results of the first option are relatively clear. Your numbers diminish, you become persecuted, you attempt legal remedies to your problems, but we'll find that because these institutions are supported by the legal institutions are supported by the government, you will not have the opportunity to find legal redress. So you take it, and you suffer. You suffer martyrdom. Your second option is to leave. If you leave as an individual, you become an asylum question. If you leave as groups, you become refugee issues. And refugee questions become security questions in and of their own right. Now, granted, this is a stretch of the imagination, but picture, if you will, a large number of persecuted Christians of Pakistan marching toward India. The Indian government really doesn't care what your reason is that you're marching toward them. All they see is a lot of Pakistanis moving to their border. It becomes a security question. If you're refugees, you become a security question. Example, North Korean refugees, of which right now there are almost 250,000 in China, refuse to be acknowledged by the Chinese government as refugees. They're economic migrants. Because if they're recognized as refugees by the Chinese government, their international commitments require the Chinese government to provide UN support, UN access, and then also require them to provide economic support, social support, and integration. If they're quote-unquote economic migrants, China can repatriate them, which is usually what they do, which is also the equivalent of a death sentence. That's a security concern, but it's also a fundamental human rights concern. Then there's your third option. You respond. Prior to 9/11, the response, more often than not being violence by a minority group, was a national concern, maybe a regional concern. Post 9/11, regardless of whatever your reason for violent response, for which there is never really a justifiable reason, but if you feel as if you have no other recourse, no other redress, you carry out acts of violence, you're no longer a problem simply of that country or its neighbors, you're a problem of the world and more than certainly a problem of the United States. Which means the targeted religious minority suffering persecution is now labeled as a terrorist group, a security problem. How do we deal with security problems like this? We can spend countless amounts of taxpayer money asking the questions in congressional committees. We can spend countless hours of academic study on what causes persecution and discrimination. Or we can look at the questions which cause these issues in the first place and redress them. Political solutions, security solutions, economic solutions. But the ultimate reality is that without an understanding of these principles that I discussed at the beginning, of the role that these issues play in the first place, without a grasping that these are fundamental rights issues, we could never even get to the point of wasting taxpayer time, and taxpayer and academic money. And I'll tell you why. Bear with me when I say this. but freedom of religion is the bastard stepchild of human rights. Now, what do I mean by that? How many people here know Amnesty International? How many know Human Rights Watch? They are the two largest, most important, most active, and most effective human rights organizations in the world. Neither one of them has a full-time religious freedom staff person, either at their global headquarters or in their national offices. They have people who are very good on religious freedom in some of the regions, but something which is a fundamental human right is not even given equal right within an institutional structure of organizations whose primary focus is fundamental human rights. Because it's the forgotten issue. Not completely forgotten. And for that, I do have to thank the namesake of this institution. In 1998, the Congress unanimously passed the International Religious Freedom Act, which was quickly signed by President Clinton into law. The International Religious Freedom Act stated that freedom of religion was to become one of the top 5 foreign policy priorities of the United States government, period. In every one of our bilateral discussions with countries around the world, we were required to engage in discussions, dialogue, and negotiations on freedom of religion, conditions, and laws in their countries. Not just individual cases, but the actual structures, legislative, statutory, otherwise, that discriminate or persecute against religious minorities. Administratively, it created an Office of International Religious Freedom at the State Department, headed by an ambassador at large. How many people knew we had a religious freedom ambassador? That answer is the same for members of Congress when I ask them, by the way, so don't worry. Administratively, it also created a United States Commission on International Religious Freedom, modeled on the U.S. Civil Rights Commission, whose job it was to integrate freedom of religion into overall U.S. foreign policy, to work with the State Department, the Commerce Department, the Justice Department, and all U.S. government agencies that had some impact on foreign policy, to engage with them on how better freedom of religion can be directed and implemented. It also established what Congress and government, U.S. government is great at doing, more reports. The annual report on international religious freedom. There are 13 of us in the world who actually read it. The other 12 are countries who are listed and don't like how they're labeled in the report. What we've done is created, what we've done with international religious freedom is what we so often do with social problems in the United States. We give it to the government and we forget about it. My argument was when we were dealing with this in the first place, and I sat in some very long meetings that made me pull my hair out, and I have proof, that said we've got to do more than give it to the government. Now's not the time for us to sit back and let it happen. Now's the time for us to be even more engaged and more active. Because one of the things that the Act created was a list of something called Countries of Particular Concern for Severe Violations of Religious Freedom, CPCs. According to the Act, these are the most severe violators of religious freedom around the world. The term severe violations of religious freedom was never defined in the law. And so that was left to the discretion of the President and the Secretary of State to define what severe violations of religious freedom were. But for most of us, that shouldn't be a difficult thing to think about. What would be a severe violation? Extrajudicial killings, extrajudicial imprisonment, torture, murder, rape, organ stealing, to name just a few. So, of course, the State Department and the U.S. government went about its usual way of doing things. We said, China, absolutely. China deserves to be on the list. Iran, Sure, of course, Iran deserves to be on the list. North Korea, absolutely. North Korea deserves to be on the list. Who else don't we have diplomatic relations with? They're on the list too. And what the CPC system does is says, when you're labeled as a CPC, a mechanism automatically begins that says we move towards sanctions until you do something to prove you don't deserve it. China's still on the CPC list. Iran's still on the CPC list. North Korea's still on the CPC list. Actually, everybody's still on the CPC list that was on the CPC list before, except Vietnam. But we'll get to that in a second. Part of the reason why most of these countries are still on the list is because there was no real teeth put to the bill. Even though there's a 15-level sanctions regime established, there are two clauses which make things a little bit easier. One, the president cannot initiate sanctions so he deems for national security reasons. Two, if a country is already being sanctioned by the United States for something else, those sanctions are now double-hatted, which means if you're being sanctioned for economic violations, then those same sanctions are in place, but now it's considered for also religious freedom violations. Not until 2006 did we have countries that were finally lobbied strong enough to be added to the list that had not been under sanction before. Vietnam, Eritrea, and Saudi Arabia. That was 2006, August. Unbeknownst to the general public, in February of 2007, Vietnam was removed from the CPC list. Because in late 2007, President Bush was going to Vietnam to sign a permanent normal trade relations treaty with Vietnam. And it would have harmed our economic interests if we were defending fundamental rights. Saudi Arabia was never sanctioned. A subsection of the sanction law was pulled in which said that, well, it doesn't actually require immediate sanctioning. You can begin a discussion process. And if they say they're going to do something that are going to get them off the list, that's good enough, as long as we begin that dialogue process. So the Saudis told us they would stop producing school textbooks that were discriminatory against religious minorities. I didn't bring one with me because it's in Arabic and it wasn't going to help you or me. But I have a copy of that textbook in my office and the English translation, which still describes Jews in the language that you would expect to hear from the Saudi government, and still describes Christians in the language as you would expect to hear from the Saudi government. And offline, I would be happy to tell you what those words are. I don't say those publicly in a group of mixed company. But Saudi Arabia never faced sanctions. They promised to do things which they didn't do, but they did not face sanctions. However, Eritrea, which is about this big, in Africa, and is the committer of tremendous religious freedom and human rights violations and deserved of the CPC title, is the only country sanctioned by the United States government in and of its own right for freedom of religion violations. There's something to be proud of. Religious freedom is the bastard stepchild of human rights. There are 1.1 million Christians in Saudi Arabia. How many people knew that? 1.1 million. No access to a priest, and the only country in the world without a church. North Korea has churches. As a matter of fact, North Korea just built a Russian Orthodox cathedral in Pyongyang and a monastery there, and shipped 20 North Korean seminarians to Moscow every year to be trained as Russian Orthodox priests. But Saudi Arabia didn't get sanctioned. tell me that religious freedom does not have economic impact. Tell me that religious freedom does not play a role on global economics. Tell me, more importantly, that it can't when I tell you that. Freedom of religion is not only a political question. I deal with it as a political question. I deal with it as an economic question. I deal with it as a theological question. And I'm running out of time, so we'll end with this concept. Freedom of religion requires engagement with every segment of society because most segments of society don't get it. 2 points. We institutionally in my office break down our programs to reflect the need for engagement with every segment of society, to reflect what we're talking about. But part of the reason for that is this. When we talk about the media, when the pedophilia crisis struck the Catholic Church in the United States, CNN did not have a religion reporter. They sent their entertainment reporter to cover it. The majority of major newspapers in the United States, their religion reporters do not have a background in religion. They come from the political beat. So the stories that are told as news stories are coming not from the lenses of people who understand religion, but from people who understand politics. Or, in CNN's case, entertainment. The last point, and the need for theological engagement. I'm not a theologian. I'm Roman Catholic by background, and there are bishops around the world quaking in their mitres at the thought of my talking theology. But there's a requirement for the engagement of theological discussion on these issues. You know, we've done historically interfaith dialogue for thousands of years, and we've always done it the same. The way we've dealt with interfaith dialogue was one of two. It was at the very, very top or the very, very bottom. At the very, very top, it was everybody agreeing on what we already agree on and disagreeing what we already disagree on, and there's not going to be any movement forward. We're going to leave it at that. The status quo is comfortable. At the bottom, it's general public holding hands, singing Kumbaya, going to dinners, having events that show that we all get along, we like one another, but there's no movement forward. It's social engagement. It's not theological engagement. Freedom of religion, much like every other issue that faces a society, faces a religion. Every religion in the world has individuals and believers who suffer from AIDS, who suffer from drug abuse, who suffer from poverty, who suffer from hunger. These are the issues that we need to be engaging on at theological level. Is theological social action, theological social engagement. And so our focus on this, since we're not a hunger organization, or an AIDS organization, or a poverty organization, is to look on the engagement of freedom of religion. Because in those countries like those I've already discussed, if there is not an understanding on the part of the theological leadership, of the religious leadership, of the theological right of the other to be different, because really, what is religious freedom? Religious freedom is the political protection of the right to be different. That under law, I can believe something different than you believe and not suffer political or social oppression as a result of it. That will not happen in many countries if the religious leadership is not engaged with it. And so it becomes fundamentally necessary for that theological engagement if we're going to have any true understanding of the protection of these fundamental rights. And as I've said 1,000 times, as I'm sure you're as sick of hearing as I'm sick of saying, freedom of religion is an engagement with every segment of society. It's not just a church-state issue. It's also not just a top and bottom issue. It's a mid-level issue. It's something we all need to know about. And as I travel the country, and I don't say this in a pejorative sense, I say this in a truly knowledge sense. I never cease to be amazed by the ignorance, the absence of information of the average American on what their own co-religionists face overseas, let alone what others face. And freedom of religion, freedom of belief, freedom of conscience, whatever terminology you wish to use for it, religious freedom, religious liberty, is ultimately a question of information. It's ultimately a question of knowledge. Because with knowledge comes the understanding that there are those who are different, but those who are different share the same rights. I hope that what I said this evening had a little bit of meaning to it and a little bit of purpose, and I'm more than happy to take your questions. Thank you very much for allowing me to be here tonight.
We do have time for some questions. I'm going to ask for the volunteers with the mics to come on out. If you can raise your hand, we'll get a microphone to you. Bill, right behind you.
I'm sure you've probably received this question before, but
Those are my favorite ones. I have a canned answer for it.
Okay, great. I think a skeptic to this would probably say there's usually some sort of subtext to religious conflict, and that's the issue of natural resource. So how would you respond to that? Someone who's saying all this religious conflict is just a bunch of phooey, what it's really about is natural resources.
I'd say you're wrong on both fronts. Because it's not always about natural resources. But it's also not always about religion. I mean, the fact of the matter is that the majority of religious conflicts that are defined as religious conflicts are not religious conflicts. They're conflicts that are rooted in some other deeper problem, but it becomes very easy to gain supporters and believers behind a certain political position when you use the religion term. And whether we're talking about the Tamil Tigers in Sri Lanka, or we're talking about the Israelis and the Palestinians, or we're talking the clash of civilizations. Issues of religion are integral, they're intimate, they're important, but they are not always the driving forces. And we have to be careful, and this is part of the reason why we engage with the media and with political leaders, is because we very often find that people are using the wrong terminology, which only serves to escalate the problem. And I'll give you an anecdotal example of what I'm talking about. In 1998, an evangelical missionary in India was killed by the predominantly animist population to which he was evangelizing in a very gruesome way, he and his two sons. Everybody around the world said this is a religious freedom violation, this is a religious freedom problem, it was persecution. Okay, but look at the situation on the ground. Animists in the northeast area of India believe in a menstrual cycle of the earth. They believe that it's appropriate to sow and reap and plant at certain times of the year out of respect for the earth. If people from that belief are converted to Christianity, then they don't respect and hold that same cycle. And so there are economic interests and economic benefits that came to people of this population who were converting. The animists were not complaining about the conversion, they were complaining about the economics that came with it. And so their murder of the missionary was not because, oh no, people are becoming Christian. It's because, oh no, these Christians are getting better economic deals than we are. And so we have to be very, very careful to go all the way back to the source, all the way back to the beginning of the problem. Because if we continue to use religion as the answer to every problem, or the cause of every problem, then we end up saying, let's get rid of religion and we'll all be fine. Well, trying to get rid of religion is like trying to change DNA. It just doesn't happen. You know, religion is integral to who we are. Atheists are religious people. You make a theological decision on how you see the world, however you believe. And so asking people to forget about religion is like asking them to forget about who they are. I hope that answered your question.
Dr. Burrow.
In addressing the world, starting at home, in relationship to religious freedom here, stem cell research is about a belief system that's based on religion. We still have conflict about created science being taught in schools, conflict. We allow, due to freedom of speech, Mitt Romney to be attacked as a Mormon and much less cut off at the knees because of that. where would we be if we started at home and maybe teaching the difference between fact and a belief structure, and that religion, to accept religions, but that what you believe is a personal decision and that it's a belief. It's not something that's a concrete fact that should dictate the law.
The world, especially the United States, take a step back. The world moves in periods of pendulums. And we swing back and forth, whether they be in cultures and societies and religions, from one end of the extreme to the other. And right now in the United States, we're in an element of a swing of that pendulum where we see a significant rise in individual religious belief. We don't necessarily see a rise in individual religious identity, which is a different issue. People are becoming more spiritual. A recent Pew study poll says that the majority of people are identifying themselves as spiritual or as believers, but not as members of a religious institution. This is where we in the United States have a benefit that other people don't, and that's the Constitution and the First Amendment. Our founding fathers were very wise men. We don't have a religious country, but we have a secular system. And this was a mistake we made in Iraq and Afghanistan. We created constitutions to reflect a culture rather than constitutions that protected a culture from itself. And that's what our founders did. Our founders knew what we were like. Our founders knew very well that people are not good things, that we by nature are flawed and fail, and that we will rise to mob mentality. And that was the great fear of the founders. The great thing about the American system of government is that our system remains secular. And where we must always be vigilant is to maintain the secular nature of the institution, the secular nature of the government, without in any way infringing on the religious rights of the nation. America has always been a religious nation. Even if you read the writings and the speeches of the Founding Fathers, they themselves were religious men who knew that religious men and women did good things and would do good things in society. But they also knew that given the opportunity, groups of individuals would use their common structure to take over systems. And I agree with you that we do need to be teaching the concept of secularism not as a religious belief, not in the French model where secular humanism becomes the state religion, but in a way to say you're free to believe what you wish to believe, but so's that guy. As long as that guy's beliefs don't infringe on your rights and your beliefs don't infringe on his. And that's where we're having a failure, is that at our most basic educational levels, we're not teaching what our own fundamental rights are here in the United States and what are protected by the Constitution. Thank you.
Over here.
For those of us who are old enough to remember, John Naisbitt wrote in Megatrends that when society is under stress, that's when fundamental religions arise and become popular. Would you comment on some of the extremes in religion in our country right now and what effect you think that's having?
I'm sorry to smile when you say that, but I smile because when we talk about extremes in religion, the question becomes, how is religion in itself not an extreme? And the reason I say that is not to say that all religion is bad. Jesus, don't quote me that says that all religion is bad. What I'm saying, in fact, is we take a leap of faith. That's the whole point of it. You know, as I said, I'm a Catholic. But if you take a step back from my beliefs, my central sacrament is based on cannibalism. So where is it that this is not in some way an extreme? So what I'm saying is, when I answer your question, is we take a leap of faith because that's what it is. It's belief. When we talk about extremism, we're talking about politics. We're not talking about faith. What we're talking about is the expression of beliefs in a way which are either in violation of social norm or a violation of law. And so that's what we're talking about with extremism. So in other words, don't get me wrong, Osama bin Laden is not a religious leader. Osama bin Laden is a politician who uses religious language to get his point, to get followers, to gain authority, and to make a message. And just as a quick aside on that one, we've all seen the Osama bin Laden videos. We've seen him shooting an AK-47. We've seen him giving rousing speeches. How many have we seen of him praying? Huh. Not one. So don't fall into the trap that is very easy to fall into to say that extremism is a religious issue. Extremism is a political issue, pure and simple. But what we are seeing in the United States today is a stronger expression of religious belief in political action. And there's both good and bad to that. That's for the system to figure out on its own. I'm really not smart enough to even try and get into that. But there are, we do see movements within our culture today, not just because we're under social and national stress or because some of us might be bitter and others might not, that there is in fact, there are elements of society that do find their comfort in certain political expression of their beliefs. Does that make sense? Did that? Okay.
Annie?
As I listen to your principles of the individual faith, the belief system, and the religious exercise that encompass the two, and as I listen to the pendulum of where we are, what is and I come to the conclusion that there's global illiteracy on these issues. What is the impact of technology on impacting this global ignorance around these three principles? If I believe what you were trying to say or did say, is that our government is aware as it relates to these three, and therefore we are more confused now and more illiterate than ever before because of the global technology that exposes us to these religious belief systems out there, to the religious dominations that are out there. And then when I think in terms of systems impacting systems, where are we as it relates to the impact of technology on these systems of belief, religions?
Right. We're in an alphabet soup situation, frankly. I'm a big fan of technology. I think it's great. The internet is the best thing ever. I love it. I just got on Facebook. I can't get off. I love it. But why? Technology gives us access to people and things we would never otherwise be able to understand or experience. The problem becomes not what we receive, but what we do with it. And this is where I blame not just the government. I do blame the government in some sense on this, but this is where I blame parents, and where I blame families, and where I blame religious leaders, and where I blame schools. Our children are not raised, they're not reared with formed and informed consciences. That technology is used in many ways to replace parents and babysitters, and technology is given to children, and children suck things in. They consume it. They're a blank slate. They're a sponge of information. They'll take it all in. And so the problem becomes not that it's there, but it's that we don't teach kids what to do with it when they get it. We talk about discrimination. Discrimination is a horrible thing, but being discriminating is not. to have a discriminating mind that permits you to be able to judge between right and wrong, to judge between good and bad, to judge between true and false. I mean, I'll give you a great example of this. Google my last name when you go home. Google me. There are 6,000 pages about me on the internet. 2 of them are by a guy who claims I'm a front for the Scientologists because I don't say they're crazy. I say they deserve to be protected just like every other crazy religion deserves to be protected. But this same guy put up 2 pages out of the 6,000 you find about me, and that becomes the definition of me, if people choose it to be the definition. Because we make our decisions based on those things, not which are true or false, not which are right or wrong, not which are anything other than what we choose them to be, because we can't make the difference. We're not created with formed and informed consciences. They are, hence their name, formed and informed. But the problem is that we're not being trained as children with that. We're not being challenged as adults in that. You know, how many times do we go home and turn on the cable television and we are fed our thoughts by watching the news?
Annie, hold on. Annie.
Synagogue.
Annie.
The oldest synagogue, the oldest preacher, from the perspective that I was dealing with you, they are babies too.
Oh, yeah.
The oldest priest that has not been conditioned to be discriminatory in what they receive and what they do with it.
Sure.
So we have,
Yeah, this is
and
not,
that's,
look,
that's what I'm saying,
yeah,
is the global ignorance.
don't hear me wrong on this. I'm not saying this is a generational issue. I'm saying this is a societal issue. That this is really a societal issue. And, you know, this is where I have great respect for our Jewish friends, our Jewish brothers and sisters. Purim is a tremendous holiday that's based on from the book of Esther, which talks about how Esther saved her people. But the modern celebration of Purim is done in such a way that from the outside, and don't, again, much like the theology from the Catholics, this isn't real theology from me on this either, but the perception is such that you can see it as a combination from a Catholic of St. Patrick's Day and Halloween. That people dress up, they become excited, they become happy, they celebrate. What's the point of this? I asked a rabbi, I lived in Israel in 1995, and Purim was coming around, and I asked a Hasidic, an ultra-Orthodox rabbi, what's the purpose of Purim? And he looked at me and he thought for a second, and he says, it's simple. 3 words: to get drunk. And I said, good premise. I like it. I'm not sure the rabbis of old had thought of it that way. He says, no, they did. Because the purpose of Purim is such that even when you're inebriated, if you could tell the difference between good and evil, you have no excuse for not knowing when you're sober. And I thought for a second and I said, that's either the wisest thing I've ever heard or the craziest thing I ever heard, but either way it makes great sense. And this is ultimately the point that I'm getting at, which is if we aren't formed to be able to know the difference between right and wrong, if we're not formed to be able to make decisions and judgments on average everyday things, then the stuff that's thrown at us about Islam, that's thrown at us about Judaism, that's thrown at us about extremism, is thrown at us about all kinds of things, we're going to believe it because we don't know any better, and we don't know how to make that difference. And then you translate that, you know, if you think about this, the oldest recorded act of violence in history is religious persecution from a Judeo-Christian concept. The first act of violence in the Bible was Cain killing Abel. Over what? Cain was jealous of Abel's sacrifice, which God liked better. It's religious persecution. And so if we look at it in those terms, if we look at it in terms of not knowing the difference, then it becomes very easy to redo Cain and Abel.
Now, if I would have read holysmoke.org, I would have found out that you support
See?
Scientology.
Told you. Told you.
It's true. It comes up first thing. Any more questions?
Yeah.
Right in the middle.
I am currently reading Eckhart Tolle's book, A New Earth, which I recommend to everyone if you haven't heard it or read it. And he touches on a little bit of what you said about religion and how we're all after you scratch the surface and get past the dogma and the legalities of everything, we're all trying to get to the same place. Such as we're all trying to get to Canada, but we're all coming from different places. If you come from Europe, if you come from Arkansas, if you come from Skunk Hollow, whatever. That really touched me, and I've always taught our children. We have two small children, and I've always instilled in them to not see color, not see races. We're all deep down, once you get past our form, our soul is the same. We are no different than anyone else. So this has awakened me to, with this book and also what you're saying has awakened me to religious differences and how we are all trying to get to the same place. This is something that we are doing in our home with our children and making it a very, a big deal, but not too much of a big deal, just to be accepting of others for whatever reason, not better, not worse, just different, and to embrace our differences. Beyond that, how can I, as someone who is probably not going to travel to Darfur or Iran, I have no plans to do that.
It's beautiful this time of year.
What can I do here, where I am, outside of my family, and possibly stepping out of my comfort zones? I'm completely fine doing that. What can I do as a parent, as a wife, as a 30-something within my social community? What can I do to further this cause of religious freedom and, just let everybody know that we're deep down, past the surface, past religion, past race, we're all the same. What can I do where I am?
Write us checks. That always works.
I think my husband can tell you I know how to write checks. I can swipe the credit card.
Yeah, credit cards are fine too.
What can I do? Anybody
I
can do that. What can I do beyond that, beyond money and?
Sure. No, your question is the kind of question that I love to get, because there is so much that can be done. You're already doing the most important thing. You're teaching your children. That's the most important thing. You hit on something very important, particularly in our timing following the Pope's visit. One of the things that we have to keep in mind when we talk about freedom of religion is, remember I was talking about spirituality, faith, religion. To be a religion, though, you've got to believe that you have a monopoly on truth and salvation. It's what makes you a religion. It's Yahweh or the highway. It's pretty much the way it is. But that's pretty much it. But every religion believes that. But this is where the differences come. And this is where individuals, especially parents, and even in peer groups, in relationships and everything, what does that acknowledgement of the existence of truth require and demand? Not request. Require and demand. It requires and demands pursuit of truth, which means that each one of us has a responsibility, called by whatever faith we belong to, because even though faiths are different, there is always that kernel of sameness in the requirement of us to pursue what we believe. It's know what you believe, first of all. If you don't know what you believe, if you don't know what your religion means, if you don't know what the most fundamental precepts and tenets of your faith is, you're not about in any way to do good when you talk to somebody who doesn't believe what you believe. And I'm not saying go out and proselytize. I'm not saying go out and evangelize. I'm saying self-evangelize. Teach yourself. Go read about what you believe. If you don't like it, change it. You have a right to do that. You've got free will, change it. Because I'm a firm believer in the principle that everybody has the right to be wrong. Because ultimately, that's what this is. Freedom of religion is the right of everybody to be wrong. Because I know, I know in my faith is right. I have to. I belong to it. I believe it. And I accept because of that what you believe is wrong. But, and it's that but that's the important thing. But I have to respect your right to be wrong. I have to respect and protect your right to be different. And that's what we need to be teaching not only ourselves and our children, but each other, is that it's not about persecuting somebody because they're different. It's about protecting them because they're different. And this is my anger with governments. This is my particular anger with the U.S. government, is that governments will use the institutions at their availability to defend the faiths that they like or they don't like. And it's not just in Saudi Arabia or China. It's in France and Germany and Belgium and Russia and Latin America. And it could be here too, if we let it. But the fact of the matter is that we have the responsibility to not just hold our elected officials responsible. You hear that from every political person that comes in here. It's not just holding them responsible. Please, they got to be responsible for so much other stuff. They're barely responsible for themselves. It's holding yourselves accountable. And it's holding your families accountable. And it's holding your friends accountable. Because it's not just, we've got racial problems in this country, but we're moving in the right direction. Where we're not moving in the right direction is religious problems. That religious discrimination in the United States is becoming the new race issue. And we're not facing it, and we're not confronting it, and we're not doing anything about it. Because we don't know how, and we're afraid to. Because what are you not supposed to talk about at dinner? Religion and politics. But if we don't talk about it, it gets us to a clash of civilizations. Not over there, right in our own homes. So I hope that...
Unfortunately, I have to be the bad guy and cut this off. We could listen to you talk all day. Appreciate you coming.
Ladies and
Let's
gentlemen,
give,
thank you very much.
A big round of applause.